Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Whiting, Executive Director of St. John's Church Foundation. And today I'm very lucky to have as my interview and my special guest, Jon Kukla. Hi, Jon.
Hey, how are you?
Doing well. Thanks for joining us in the virtual realm today. Jon Kukla is an author and a historian, and he is a brand new member to our Leadership Council. The foundation has formed a Leadership Council to help prepare us for the 250th anniversary of Patrick Henry's speech, which is quickly approaching. In 2025, we will have all sorts of programs in place to celebrate Mr. Henry's speech and that anniversary. So we're very glad to have you on as our newest Leadership Council member. Jon was also at one point the director of Red Hill, which is owned by the Patrick Henry Memorial, and that is where Patrick Henry is buried. A lot of people think he was buried at St. John's, but no, he was buried at Red Hill. So if you have time, we encourage you to go visit our friends at Red Hill. It's an amazing place. And in fact, Jon, the first time I met you was at Red Hill.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You came down to look at some properties across the river in Halifax, I think it was.
You were so nice. I was looking at 7 Islands.
Right.
One of Patrick Henry's many properties. How many did he own over his life?
Well, he lived in 13 different places during the course of his life. And in fact, one of his boyhood friends said that he changed houses as easily as most people change underwear.
I believe it. What was so cool is we walked in the back and down the hill and found Sarah Henry's grave, one of his daughters, didn't we?
I think so. Yeah.
Well, this is a perfect segue. One of the things that people talk to us about and things we want to know more, can you tell us more about Patrick Henry the man?
One of the things that I think I did successfully in my book was tried to get outside the rut that Patrick Henry scholarship and biography has been in for 2 centuries, and that is the fact that his fame as an orator eclipsed everything else that was that he did in his life. And it just people just never sort of got past that, and as a result, they didn't see the man himself, if you will, and they certainly didn't see other dimensions of his life, and particularly his career. He was a really pretty effective governor. Served five terms as governor, first elected governor of the Commonwealth, and so on. And he was half decent in the couple of months that he spent as commander of the Virginia troops at the beginning of the Revolution, and so on. He was probably about 5'7". We don't really know for sure. But it's nobody comments on his height. So he's not tall like Jefferson or Washington. He's not short like Madison. So okay, he's probably in that 5'7", 5'8", whatever range. People described him as particularly later in life as being sort of stoop-shouldered. And in fact, one of the things that happened. Apparently, it was absolutely magical when he did sort of go from speaking to oratorical flights of genius. And one of the things that they always commented about was that, among other things, that's when he actually stood upright to his full height, whereas most of the other time he was just a little bit stoop-shouldered. He was the child of a Virginia gentry mother and an immigrant Scotsman. His father, John Henry, was a graduate of the University of Aberdeen, which made him kind of unusual in the 18th century to have that kind of educational credentials. His uncle was a minister in the Anglican Church, also a Scots immigrant, a couple years older than Henry's father. And he, one of the interesting things I think about that side of the family, the paternal side of the family in Scotland, is that they were Anglicans, And of course, in Scotland, the established church is the Presbyterian kirk, and so they were, in a sense, the family had associations, although Anglican had associations with being in a dissenting position in society. He was the second child of the marriage. His mother was a wealthy widow who owned big plantation in Studley in Hanover County. Henry was her second child. I think the total there were about like 6 or 7. I think most 2 boys and the rest girls. As a lad, he basically studied with his father. So in fact, people who are involved in the homeschool movement regard Henry as their favorite patriot because he was a homeschooler.
Yeah.
Anyway, he studied with his father, and there's some evidence that's too detailed to get into it, in a conversation. But I've been tracking down some evidence that indicates that he was plugged into some of the reading that was common to the university curriculum in Scotland at the time. At any rate, he seems to have been a very well-liked boy and a well-liked young man, and he was, in fact, Jefferson was sort of critical about the fact that he was chummy with all levels of society. He liked to go hunting, liked to go fishing. He had a sense of humor. He was one of the stories told is that somehow or other, when out in canoes in the Pamunkey River, he would somehow or other arrange to overturn the canoe, but and throw his friends into the water. But somehow or other, it always seemed that he had taken off his outer clothes and in preparation for the prank.
I love it. That's great.
He had, there's lots of anecdotes about his, sort of jokes and his use of humor and stuff in his, not only, I suppose, less in his speeches than in, some of his courtroom performance, because among other things, of course, he was a phenomenally successful trial lawyer. That brings with it certain skills of, and I think one of the arguments I make in the book is that part of his success as an orator was that he was a very good listener. And apparently, there are accounts of basically he could talk with people and sort of figure out where they were, and this was something that was a great benefit to a trial lawyer who's basically arguing cases in front of a jury of Virginia farmers. He could sort of figure, and in fact, there's an interesting, it's well known that he was also influenced in his oratory by the Presbyterian evangelist Samuel Davies, who was located in Hanover, and his mother was, again, an interesting wrinkle on the religious life of the family. His father's a fairly conservative Anglican, would have called himself a priest. His dad is, a member of the vestry. His mother, however, was a follower of Samuel Davies and used to go off to services at Davies's meeting house. And the story is that on the way back, she would basically quiz the kids about what Davies said and how he said it and so on. And of course, Davies was one of the people in the 18th century who was reputed to be a really terrific orator. And Henry clearly learned from him. There is a passage in one of Davies's sermons in which he describes the responsibility of an evangelical preacher. And for Davies, that responsibility is not to sort of teach or argue or put forward theological principles, but rather to persuade in other words, to speak not to the mind but to the heart, and to persuade the listener to to become a person of faith, not by logical theological argument, but rather by emotional persuasion. And there is a sense in which Henry learned that lesson really well. Again, Jefferson talks about how he would listen to Henry speak and it just be transported by it and carried away, and then he says, and then afterwards I'd say to myself, what did he say? And I couldn't figure it out. And of course, the point is that that Henry was appealing to try to persuade his audience rather than essentially reciting a legal brief. And and as I said, he was fairly well appears to have been very, very popular. Again, Jefferson talks about how he met Henry. First time he met Henry was at a party. Christmas party.
Playing the fiddle, yeah.
Yeah. Christmas party in Hanover, and one of the comments that Jefferson makes at the time, in recalling this first meeting with Henry, is that Henry didn't, he was sociable and he was, great at small talk and all, but he didn't seem to want to talk about anything deeply philosophical. And people sort of quote that anecdote as though it were an indication that supporting Jefferson's notion that Henry was less than well read and unintelligent and so on. And finally, when I'm reading that, I'm thinking, like, for crying out loud, it's a Christmas party.
Yeah. You're not going to be getting into debates.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Well, when I think about Henry, and of course we do our Liberty or Death reenactments, I think about our actors, and it makes me realize, every good trial lawyer and every good attorney has a little bit of actor in them.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that Henry definitely had that.
Yeah.
And when you read about his speeches, he's such a quick thinker that he's able to take the reaction of the crowd and put it into his speech.
One of the best stories about that is later in life, when apparently he got a little bit confused and started arguing arguing the case against his client, and the client, of course, is getting upset by this. Finally, gets Henry's attention, and Henry realizes what he's done, and sort of turns on a dime and said, well, these are the arguments that the learned counsel is going to be making. Now, let me tell you how they're wrong.
I love it. Yeah, that's cool. Right. So continuing with Mr. Henry the man, we know he got married to Sarah Shelton. And,
right.
And most people know the tragic story of her, after her fifth child, I think it was, or maybe her sixth, I've lost track, had what we would call postpartum depression. Can you give us?
Actually, what we would call it medically would be postpartum psychosis.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it apparently statistically happens in about 3 out of every 2,000 births. And of course, nowadays we can just take care of it with medical intervention that wasn't available then.
Wow. And at that point, he's living at Scotchtown in Hanover.
Yeah.
He's been fighting for 9-10 years, trying to Stamp Act, Parsons Cause, the whole 9 yards. He's getting ready to come to, and she dies about 3 weeks before he makes the speech, the Give Me Liberty speech at St. John's. Can you paint a picture of what that was like for him? We've been told that he hand fed her at sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those weird things that I when I went to Red Hill, I was trying to dig into some of the myths that surround Henry and find out which of them were true and which of them weren't. For example, the whole business of this, the accusation about him locking his wife in the basement.
Oh.
Of course, if you go to Scotchtown, it's what we know as an English basement. There's lots of parts of the country that, including my editors, who didn't know what an English basement is. We know what an English basement is, and that's if you've ever been in that room at Scotchtown, it's a lovely place. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a great big hearth and a big window, and
a brick floor.
And at any rate, the business about Henry sort of locking his wife in the basement and then going off to give her the liberty of death speech was popularized, I kid you not, in Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Oh, for crying out loud, really?
Yeah. So,
She was dead by the time he gave the speech. So, I mean.
Yeah. But it, you know, basically, I compare the situation to one that any family would face when, you know, nowadays the question is, you know, what if we have a family member who is aging and suffering from dementia, you know, can we care for them best, or can we find you know, an institution that will do it better? You know, I mean, those are very, very difficult personal situations and questions. And what were the options in the 18th century? You know, not good. Virginia actually was unusual in that it had an insane asylum. That's what they called it. But it was basically for the criminally insane, and the conditions there were horrible. I mean, they've reconstructed it at Colonial Williamsburg, and you ought to visit it.
I've seen it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's be like chained in the corner of a stall at a barn.
I've heard that read that he went to go see the insane asylum and said
that I couldn't document that one way or the other, but certainly you know, it was in Williamsburg and he was there a lot, so yeah he would have known about it. But yeah, so it's just a tragic situation, and I think he did what he could, and what we do know you know is really from, I think, the best source we have on what went on was basically from one of his physicians, I think, because Henry never spoke of it, and the fact that his wife died at Scotchtown is part of the reason that he gave up on Scotchtown and sold the place when he had an opportunity, and so, you know, and probably never went. I mean, it was just a place that had you know, sort of bad vibes from then on.
And we do know he went on to remarry Dorothea Dandridge, and had another 11 children with her.
Yep.
So I want to change the topic a little bit, but continue with Henry the Man and talk about slavery.
Yeah.
And we know that he enslaved, I think it was 70 people during his.
Yeah, we don't have accurate enough records for all of his plantations to be able to really say for sure. But based on the list of by name of slaves that show up in the inventory at the time of his death, that's certainly that's the range that of enslaved people that he was the owner of in those days. When I was writing the book, my first draft of the book, I didn't deal with slavery until 1769, which is by that time Henry's in his 30s, and it happens to be the first documented record that we have of him commenting about slavery. You know, send the manuscript off. My editor was, let's say, livid. You know, basically, John, you can't do this. You cannot write about a man who lives in a slaveholding society and not say anything about slavery until halfway through the book. You just can't do that. And he was absolutely right, of course. And the trouble was, I didn't have any direct information about Henry or his attitudes, you know, or anything having to do with, you know, and it's made worse by the fact that Hanover, where he was during those years of his life, Hanover is one of the counties that that in its wisdom sent its records to Richmond right before the Civil War for safekeeping, and then they went up in smoke when the when the General Court building burned in the evacuation fire in 1865. So Hanover's one of those sort of burned county records, or burned record counties. And so it's, it's very difficult to get at this. Well, basically what I did is I spent about two weeks poking around, trying to figure out how I could deal with addressing what was obviously very important in the life of any 18th century patriot or whatever. And so I started digging around in things like newspapers for they would have advertisements advertising runaway slaves that they wanted to get back. So I'd look for those coming from Hanover. And then what really nailed it down for me was I looked at the sermons of Samuel Davies, who was a slaveholder himself, the Presbyterian evangelist that Henry's mother followed, and also not many sermons from Henry's uncle survive. But we do have sermons from his peers, from neighboring Anglican clergymen, and so we can tell what was being preached about slavery in the 1730s and 40s when Henry was a young man. And basically, the argument that is being preached is slavery's in the Bible; it's fine. So we've had slavery for thousands of years. It's it's there. It is. So what a responsible master should do is treat his slaves well. But there's nothing morally wrong with it. So starting from that point, which I think is an accurate depiction of certainly where most Americans were in the, let's say, the 1740s. And unfortunately, it's where some Americans were in the 1960s, for crying out loud. At any rate, starting from that point, what you get in Henry's life is what seems to me to be the fairly typical arc of thoughtful 18th century Virginians, possibly thoughtful 18th century Americans. Certainly 18th century Virginians, and so it goes like something like this. You start out in his youth, slavery is perfectly acceptable, and it's all around us, and it's accepted as being as sort of a normal fact of life. And then as you move toward the Revolutionary era, there are certain there are built-in concepts about the politics of the Revolution that implicate the word slavery. That is to say that in quite aside from the labor system or the racial prejudice that goes with chattel slavery as a demeaning treatment of our fellow human beings. Quite apart from that, there's a definite or a definition of slavery that figures in political rhetoric in the 18th century, and that is they believe that in order to be independent, you have to be self-sufficient, and you have to be essentially in control of yourself and in control of your property. And so if people, for example, if Parliament is going to legislate in ways that that can take away our property without our consent, the argument goes basically, if I can't control my own property and Parliament can take it all away, then they're treating me like a slave because I don't have control over my own life and property. And so in the 18th century, in political terms, you have that juxtaposition of, on the one hand, the ideal of an independent gentleman or whatever, and then and at the other, the abject situation of somebody who has basically been turned into a slave because all of his property's been denied. So if you're talking about politics in those terms. What happens, as Bernard Bailyn writes in his wonderful book, The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, he's got this great chapter called The Contagion of Liberty, in which he talks about how you go from the rhetoric of English politics, and it has implications for many other things, and one of them, of course, is slavery. So by the 1760s, Henry is expressing in this little fragment that survives. He's expressing discomfort with the way in which slavery degrades not only the victims of it, the immediate victims of it, but the way in which it basically forces society to become backward. And basically in this 1760s piece, he talks about how he compares the land values around Williamsburg with the land values around Philadelphia, and basically argues that it's much better, using the land values as an indication of the of a thriving society, if you will, a thriving economy. Okay, so he argues basically that that Virginia is backward, and part of the reason that it's backward is because it has slavery rather than free labor, and it's so much better to encourage immigration and have free laborers and stuff than to have this slave system. Now, that's about 1769. By 1773, okay, 3 years before the Revolution, Henry is in correspondence with one of the really early Quaker sort of proto-abolitionists in Virginia, who's basically lobbying for the right of manumission, is what the guy named Robert Pleasance. And so he's in correspondence with Pleasance, and Pleasance basically has about a 15-year political relationship with Henry. And so what we have is Henry's letter to Robert Pleasance, 1773, in which he basically says, slavery is wrong. It cannot be justified. It is morally wrong. It can't be justified by philosophy or by religion. It's just plain wrong. And then he goes on, and yet I own slaves of my own purchase, and so on. Now, later, I mean, Henry helps Pleasance free some of his slaves. Henry supports the expansion of the laws for the manumission of slavery. But after the Revolution, there are some people in Virginia, particularly in Southside, it seems, in the southern, south of the James, some of those agricultural counties, who start arguing that slavery needs to be protected. So there is a beginnings of a kind of a pro-slavery argument. It's not the kind of pro-slavery argument that we associate with the decades before the Civil War, where some of those guys were actually arguing that slavery was a positive good. But it's not that. It's just basically, it's an economic necessity. That's and therefore it ought to be protected. And so it's a kind of maybe it's less pro-slavery than anti-abolition. But at any rate, that's the context in which Henry and any of these Virginians have to deal with, is that a lot of their constituents, want to be able to hold slaves and do not agree with, the noble vision that Henry's putting forward, that it's wrong. Or if they think it's wrong, it's okay, it's wrong, but what am I going to do about it? And ultimately, that's where Henry ends up. Is we're stuck with them. We're stuck with slavery. We can't figure out a way to get out of it. And therefore, what you should do is treat your slaves well and teach them to read the Bible so that they can, find their way to religion. It may sound like feudal, but the important thing to remember is, starting in 1773 and with the Revolution, for these guys, slavery's wrong. It's wrong.
Yeah. They know it's wrong.
They know it's wrong.
Yeah.
They don't know how to get rid of it. they don't know quite what to do, but it's wrong. And so I've often pointed out that when we criticize the founding generation for failing to deal with slavery, for failing to get rid of it, the standard that we're measuring their failure by is the standard that they set. It's wrong. Mm. And in a sort of in long-term historical perspective, the decision that slavery is wrong is an important step in the right direction.
So when you think about Mr. Henry's speech at St. John's, when he is using the images, clearly the image of being enslaved to it, while knowing fully that it's wrong, how do you explain that? How do you explain that?
Well, it's very difficult to think our way back into the world of any other generation. We can't imagine how awful slavery was.
Oh God, no. Yeah.
And we should never minimize
right.
the fact that it was a terrible system, and that it really hurt and killed people. That said, it certainly is a whole lot easier to condemn an earlier generation for their failings than it is to see the ways in which we fall short of what we should be doing. We don't have to put our heroes on a pedestal and believe that they're somehow perfect, because they aren't.
Right.
And it's important to make that point, because we're flawed, and yet we ought to try to live up to the responsibilities of being good human beings.